Porter County Perspective is being brought to you in part through donation from Chesterton Tribune, your hometown newspaper serving the entire Duneland area since 1884.
Welcome to Porter County Perspective. I'm JD Corey, WDSO's news director. Just a reminder that today's program has been pre-recorded. Joining me this afternoon is Dave Rarick. He sailed around the world and wrote a book about his trip of a lifetime. Dave is also a CHS graduate. Welcome to Porter County Perspective, Dave.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So, first of all, how did you get interested in sailing?
Well, I grew up here in the Indiana Dunes, and I actually grew up in Dune Acres. So right off the beach there, when I was about 12 years old, a friend of mine invited me to go sailing on a Sunfish, and that was such an exhilarating experience. You know, from that moment on, I've been hooked on sailing.
Did you have any family members who were boating enthusiasts, or are you the first?
No, my family members are all golfers. My dad was a really good golfer. My uncle and cousins and my brother, so everybody were golfers and stuff like that. I just got the bug for sailing and just couldn't let go of it.
When would you say that you began to start sailing? Would it be in like your youth or something?
Yeah, when I was 12 years old was that first time I sailed, and I think that next year I worked really hard to convince my father to buy our own little Sunfish to keep on the beach. And by the time I was 14 or 15, I was sailing as much as I could in the summertime. I moved on up to a Hobie Cat, which is a 16-foot boat, catamaran, a real fast-paced type thing. And I still, have conversations with a lot of my high school friends who remember going sailing with me on that. But from there, I just kept advancing my knowledge of sailing. When I was 20 years old, I went to work for the Outward Bound School at Hurricane Island out in Maine, and then got into big boat racing and big boat sailing on the Great Lakes and then the oceans and eventually all around the world.
And were you taking any lessons during this, or were you just teaching yourself?
For the most part, I was self-taught. I did take a course that was put on by the Valparaiso YMCA that happened out at the Michigan City Harbor. The first year, springtime, when we got our own family Sunfish, I took that course. But other than that, it was mostly just a self-learning curve, which is a slow way of doing it, but it was the only option I had.
Now, you mentioned racing. What races were you in over the years?
Well, here on the Great Lakes, the big race on the Great Lakes is the Chicago to Mackinac race, which starts in Chicago and races all the way to the north end of Lake Michigan, which is Mackinac Island. And that's 333 miles, and it usually takes 2.5, 3 days, depending on it. So that was always the big pinnacle of racing on the Great Lakes. There's a whole lot of smaller races that go between Chicago and Michigan City or different harbors. And then there's also what we call course racing, where you go out and just race around certain buoys, and you might do 3 or 4 short races over the course of the day. So I've done all of those for many years. There's also the single-handed Mackinac race, which is where I started to cut my teeth in sailing the boat single-handed by myself. And I've done 7 of those as well. So,
a big question is, what decided to make you want to travel around the world alone?
Well, when I was, I took that first sailing adventure at age 12, and probably like a lot of young men like myself, was a little bit shy about reading books and stuff like that. So I would sneak into the library and pull out sailing books and start to read about all the great sailing adventures that had happened over the course of history. And there was a particular group of sailors at that point in time who were sailing single-handed across the Atlantic, and I thought, wow, that sounds really cool. I'd like to do that. And then 1969 was the first human being who sailed around the world single-handed nonstop, a guy by the name of Robin Knox Johnson out of England. And so I was right at that particular age where that just captivated my sense of adventure, and I wanted from there on to do a single-handed race around the world.
And how old were you when you decided to take the trip?
Well, this particular trip that I actually ended up doing, so to do a race around the world, a single-handed race around the world, is a relatively expensive adventure. And for me, I'm just a carpenter and a building contractor, so it requires sponsorship, not unlike a NASCAR race car that has different sponsors that help pay the expenses of it all. So I had endeavored to do this race a number of different times, but different things fell apart, and different either sponsors decided not to fund it at the end, or I couldn't find a sponsor, or a boat did not become available. But I was on the peripheral. I was helping other guys do the race. I was helping guys prepare boats. I was helping what we call deliver boats, or sail boats from this harbor to that harbor to get things ready and all that stuff. But in about 2007, one of my sailing friends, who became very successful with his business, wanted to do bigger races around the world, and he tapped me to manage his boats for him. And then one day he said, if you really want to do this single-handed race around the world, we need to get you into this. We need to get you a boat and get you in the race. So I was 53 years old at that point in time, and that was a big step.
Can you describe the boat that you were in while you were sailing around the world?
Yeah, so the boat I was sailing around the world in is called a Class 40, which is a specific design. The design is particularly dictated by international and mostly European sailors. Most people don't know it, but France is actually sort of the epicenter of single-handed adventurous sailing. So the best single-handed sailors in the world pretty much come out of France, whether they're racing this particular boat or these massive trimarans nowadays that are 100, 110 feet long that they race by themselves. But so there are different levels of boats, but this boat was conceived by the French single-handers and some other European involvement to be a boat that would just be specifically for single-handed or short-handed racing, either across the oceans or long distances or around the world. And so it's designed to be particularly lightweight and fast and very strong, but they limit some of the technological features that raise the cost of boats. So the carbon fiber is only allowed to be used in the mast and the boom, not in the hull itself. So that contains the cost of getting into the sport a little bit. So the boat's 40 feet long. It's about 14 feet wide. We call it a pizza slice. It looks like a big triangle pizza slice. Real wide so it gets up on a plane or gets up on the surface and goes pretty fast. The mast is 60 feet high. The keel is 9 feet deep in the water. The biggest sails, the spinnakers on the boat, are 2,000 square feet, which is, the size of a moderate house these days. That's an enormous amount of sail to try to drag down by yourself when the wind's blowing 20 miles an hour. But the boats are very, very fast as far as sailboats go. Often the speeds are in the 12, 13, 14 knot range. We've had the top speed on this boat at like 28.7, I think it was, going across the North Atlantic in a storm.
Was the boat made especially for you, or was it just something that your employer gave you?
No, it was made especially for me. So we commissioned it. My sponsor gave me the opportunity to have a boat built. I did some research on the various different designs that were available. So there's a design rule, and you have to stay within the parameters of the rule, but you can design different tweaks in it. So there's, a half dozen designers in the world who have come to the class and have developed the best, fastest designs. And in looking at all the boats that were available, the boat that appeared to me to be the best boat in the world was actually built in Wellington, New Zealand. It was a Bruce Farr design. It was built in Wellington, New Zealand, and we chose that for our game plan, and that's what we had built.
Now, everyone knows a boat's got to have a name, so what did you decide to name yours and why?
Well, the boat was named Bodacious Dream. So my sponsor, they say, is a good friend of mine and all that stuff. He, too, is a single-handed sailor on the Great Lakes. And I think this was his chance to sponsor me in a wider venue, and also to promote his dream and my dream. So he had a number of boats named Bodacious, Bodacious 2, Bo 3, Bo 4, and then this one he called Bodacious Dream. So bodacious is kind of the culmination of the words bold and audacious, which sailing around the world by yourself is all of that, and dream, because this certainly was my dream and it was coming true.
About how many miles would you say that you ended up sailing on this trip?
The trip around the world, I think, was probably about 25 to 26,000 miles. The boat, actually, by the time I got done with the trip, because we'd done a number of races and stuff like that for a couple of years, planning ahead of the race to train on the boat, to get ready for the boat, prepare the boat, and all kind of stuff. So I think we probably had about 40,000 miles on the boat when we handed it off in a donation to Oak Cliff Sailing in Long Island.
How long did it take you to complete the journey?
Well, the whole journey from the start, I started October 2nd out of Jamestown, Rhode Island, which is right next to Newport, Rhode Island. Sailed down to Bermuda just to check on electronics and stuff like that, and then took off from Bermuda for Cape Town, South Africa. From Cape Town, I went to Wellington, New Zealand. From Wellington, New Zealand, the intention was to go around Cape Horn up to Uruguay, but it had become late enough in the season. I had some delays because my mother had been diagnosed with terminal cancer, and I'd gone home to see her. So the prudent thing to do at that point was to not go around Cape Horn. But so I took the alternate route up to the Galapagos Islands and then through the Panama Canal and then back to Newport. So the entire sail from Newport to Newport was 8.5 months. of which there was probably a couple of months of time spent in harbors along the way. So I think it works out to like 155 days of sailing totally over that period of time.
So what was a typical day like on the sea, or was every day just different?
That's a really interesting question, because when you're in this kind of loop, so my trip from Bermuda to Cape Town, South Africa was 42 days, and from Cape Town on to Wellington was another 52 days. So the loop is just kind of a constant day in and day out type thing, 24/7, 365. So the only thing that really defines your day are the things that you allow it to define the passing of a day. So I would have my dinner usually at about midnight at night, but I slept in 15-minute intervals. So it wasn't as though it's nighttime, and I go to sleep for 8 hours and get up and that's a new day. It's sort of a constant progression. So over the course of a day, in the morning I would do my navigation and plot my weather and course and make sure everything's okay with that. Later on, I would check the boat down, make sure everything was working well on the boat, nothing was fatiguing or chafing, the lines weren't getting ready to break or something like that. And then I would just sail the boat and that type of thing. As nighttime came, you changed your routine slightly. Before sunset, you would always check the boat again. And at nighttime, you sometimes made certain adjustments to maybe downsize the sails or whatever if the weather was getting bad, because you wanted to do that during daylight rather than at nights. But this would go on for day in and day out, so it was really hard to define a day. But the exciting days would be when you knew a storm was coming, you knew a weather front was coming or something like that, so you were prepared for this weather front to come, and the weather would ramp up, and then the weather would change, and then the storm would hit, and then go on through. But that might be over the course of 48 or 72 hours. So while you might say that was 3 days, it actually was just like one whole experience. So time had a really strange perspective out there on the water.
Were you able to dock your boat at night so you could sleep, or were you on the water overnight even?
That's a question I always get asked. What do you do at night? Do you pull over and sleep? Do you pull over and stop? But no, you're sailing 24/7, so the boat's sailing all the time. I have autopilots that drive the boat and steer it when I'm not steering it. At night, you just kept sailing right on through. Like I said, I only slept in 15-minute intervals, so I would take maybe 5 or 6 what we call cluster naps. So I would put this timer on my collar, a kitchen timer, a simple kitchen timer you'd buy down at the jewel store, and set it for 15 minutes. I'd lay my head down, it would go off. I would open my eyes, look around to make sure everything's okay, set it again, and then go back to sleep. And I might do that 5 or 6 times to catch an hour and a half's worth of sleep, and then be up for an hour or so. So it's kind of condensing your sleep cycle down into a very short period of time. People would always ask me, well, why only 15 or 20 minutes? But we figured out as single-handed sailors that the speed of the boat and the horizon for a 6-foot person is about 7 miles before the curvature of the earth falls away to where I wouldn't be able to see a ship that was on the other side of that horizon. But that ship and I, in a closing speed calculation, would transfer in about 20 minutes. So if you slept for longer than 20 or 30 minutes, it was good potential. If you had a collision course with either a ship or something else, or bad navigation or weather, you would run into it. So you try to sleep just that long, take a look around, make sure everything's okay, there isn't a strange storm brewing or something going wrong with the boat that you can fix in timing, and then get back to sleep.
Did you ever take any time to visit the areas you were sailing near?
I did. When of course, I stopped in Bermuda for a couple days to make sure my electronics were working and all that stuff. I then went on to Cape Town, South Africa, and stayed there for about 2.5 weeks to do a little recovery, physical recovery, and then to also refit the boat a little bit and prepare it for the next long journey. While I was there in Cape Town, Nelson Mandela passed away, and that was quite an enlightening experience. I didn't really know that much about Nelson Mandela other than what we had learned on the news here, on the American news channels and stuff like that back in the days, but we were very lucky in that I had a tour guide that took me on a tour of Cape Town, South Africa, and he happened to be a school teacher during the time of apartheid, and he and his wife and 2 young daughters, were forced to leave the country at night fleeing for their lives, because they were anti-apartheid protesters, and the authorities had gotten up to them and had pretty much told them, if you don't leave the country, you're not going to be here tomorrow. So got some really interesting insight and stories from him on that. Cape Town was an absolutely beautiful area. And then, of course, getting on to New Zealand, Wellington, where the boat was built, so I had time to enjoy with my friends there that built the boat and so like that. Did some great touring around New Zealand. And one of the amazing things there was the Fox Glaciers. We went down and viewed the Fox Glaciers, where we were actually able to hike out onto the Fox Glaciers with crampons and ski poles with guides, and we were able to walk through some of the caves of the glacier, which are just beautiful. And I was just back in New Zealand 2 weeks ago, and it's been 5 years now, and that glacier is virtually gone. It's melted away. So it's a really, really in-your-face example of climate change. From New Zealand, I went up to the Galapagos and spent a week in the Galapagos and saw some of the amazing stuff that's there in the Galapagos as a wildlife refuge. And then on through the Panama Canal, which was pretty fascinating as well, just from an engineering standpoint. And then back up to Newport, Rhode Island.
Were there any huge problems with your boat during the time you were sailing?
Well, there weren't any. There were some problems, and the term "huge," I guess, is a relative term. Huge to me would be something that stopped the trip or put your life in jeopardy. But I did have a couple of really exciting moments. I'm pretty particular about maintaining the boat, so I'm pretty meticulous about that because I prefer to fix things in the harbor rather than out at sea. I don't like it when things go wrong for me at sea. Because they're often very difficult to fix out there. But I had one experience where the major bolts that hold the keel onto the boat came loose, and that could have been a catastrophe had it gone awry. Had that come undone and the keel fallen off, the boat would have capsized, and I would have been floating alone in the ocean a long ways away from any kind of help. The other incident that was rather troubling, although not life-threatening, was the autopilots failed. And it took some time for me to get those fixed. Had to crawl way back in the lazarette, which is a back small little compartment, which is really too small for a guy my size to get back into. So it's pretty claustrophobic, and when you're about 1,200 miles from shore, it's a little bit unnerving to do that. But other than that, just the regular failures, a piece of gear failing or a line wearing out. But you just try to stay ahead of that by you watch every night when you check the boat, you make sure everything's looking good so it doesn't break for you in the middle of the night.
What would you say the most difficult part of the trip was?
That's always a difficult question to answer because, the degree of difficulty, and to some people's perspective, difficult is just challenging. And for me, that's often the case when I'm out there on the boat. So when things get difficult, I just see them as challenging, not necessarily like difficult as in I can't accomplish this. So there were some very heavy storms, some very heavy winds and frontal passages that were difficult to maneuver through, but were well within my capabilities. So they were challenging to me. Most difficult probably was the emotional side. We had communications on board as far as satellite communication of that, and I received a cryptic note from my sister that said, "You need to call home. Mom needs to hear your voice." And I called home, and my mother had cochlear implants or bionic ears. So it was very difficult for her to understand a conversation face to face, looking at you and watching your lips move, let alone through satellite signals that bounce, hundreds of thousands of miles around the earth to get back to somebody and up and down satellites and become somewhat of an electronic transmission. So we had a very, very difficult conversation where she explained to me she had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. And then, we hung up the phone. I was a little bit stunned and feeling very alone in the middle of the Southern Ocean, in the middle of the Tasman Sea between Australia and New Zealand. And then my computers went down. I couldn't get any further communication until I got back to New Zealand. So that made it really difficult.
So you wrote a book titled The Spirit of a Dream, A Sailor's Ultimate Journey Around the World Alone. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've decided to include within the book?
So the book Spirit of a Dream, explorations or adventures like this and all have a very limited value to the explorer themselves until you're able to share the experience with someone else. Once you get a chance to share it with someone else, then the value begins to increase considerably. And I felt it really very important for me to share with people what it's like out there in the middle of the ocean, in the middle of this beautiful planet, floating in the middle of this beautiful universe. And so I endeavored to capture the whole trip around the world from start to finish and share with it my personal and emotional and maybe some are even a little too personal experiences, but they're very important to understand what this amazing world is we live in. I also include a little bit about the lead up of the boat and the lead up of how I got to where I'm at and how that all works. But it's actually it's quite a great journey around the world, and most everybody I've talked to has told me it's just been wonderful reading, and they've really enjoyed it. It's smooth reading, it's easy reading, but it brings back that experience from out in the middle of the ocean that most people will never get a chance to see if someone like me doesn't bring it back.
How long after you completed sailing around the world did you decide to write the book?
Well, I pretty much had decided to write the book while I was going around the world, but it was probably a couple months after going around the world that I actually started to put my fingers on the computer keyboard and started to write it out. I would say that it probably took me, because I'm trying to work and make a living at the same time, so I'm writing in my spare time, but it probably took me, 16, 18 months to actually get the draft down. And then it actually took quite a while for me to refine that draft and then work through editors and then get a line up a publisher and have a publisher be willing to publish the book. And a lot of thanks to Seaworthy Publishing, who took it on as a good book to publish.
Is this the first book that you've written, or have you written before?
This is the first book I've written. I've been writing articles for sailing magazines for probably 20 or 25 years now. Writing about my experiences, whether it's sailing on the Lake Michigan or sailing across the Atlantic or things like that. I've also done a lot of, casual writing as far as blogs or very short stories and stuff, just to keep track of some of these experiences in life. So this is the first full book adventure I've been on.
And have you decided about writing any other books about sailing in the future, possibly?
Yeah, I've got another book on sailing started. It's called "If I Could Teach You to Sail." But it's not really a primer about sailing, as people might think it is, but it's more of a, how would you, kind of a philosophical look at how sailing and life are very, very similar, and how there's some great experiences learned from both of them that apply back and forth across the boundary there.
Do you have anything else you'd like to say about your book? Anything you want to say to the listeners or readers?
It's we wrote the book. I do a lot of work with kids and students in schools, talking about my experience and also talking about sustainability. And I start my talks by showing these young kids in third or fourth grade blown up globe of the Earth without any boundaries on it. And I try to explain to them that this is my playground. This is where when I'm on the water, I can go anywhere in the world. And so I spend a lot of time with kids and all. We did try to make sure the book was legible, comprehensible for younger readers. So I think it really is a great book for 13, 14, 18-year-old. There's a lot of well thought out things, and there's a lot of examples of where perseverance really pays off in life. So I think you shouldn't just look at it as a book for adults to read about dreaming about sailing around the world, but it's also a great book, I think, for younger readers who might need a little encouragement to pursue their life's dream and to hang in there and persevere.
So what would you say was your best moment or experience from this adventure of a lifetime that you took?
Wow, that's a book in and of itself, I suppose. But when people ask me, what was the most maybe what was the most beautiful thing you saw, or what was the most captivating thing you saw? And I mean, there were so many beautiful moments, the sunsets, or watching birds fly, or beautiful storms. Storms can actually be quite beautiful. You're right in the middle of them and you're working on them. But there was one particular night when I had dozed off in the cockpit, and I was abruptly woken by thunder and some rain. And I got up and I stood as you stand in the cockpit, the hardtop Dodger kind of comes about chest height on me. And I sat there and I put my arms up on top of the Dodger, and the fresh rain felt good, and the thunderstorm out. This is south of Australia, so a thunderstorm was pretty rare occurrence for that. And it blew over quite quickly, but then shortly after, I started to see these glowing orbs in the water. And they were about the size of a softball, and they glowed with that, bioluminescence, that sort of pinkish, bluish, greenish, whitish glow. And but there were hundreds of them. There were an uncountable number of them all around me in all directions, looking around me. And I'm sailing through them at probably about an 8 or 9 knot speed. And I was trying to figure out what these things were, but as far as I could see, they were glowing everywhere. And it wasn't like it was thick with them, but they were spread out. There were 10 feet between them and all, but that's a lot. And I tried real hard with a high-powered flashlight to see what it was, and I could make out the shape of some tubular thing, but I couldn't figure out what it was. And at that point, I thought, stop trying to figure this out. Just enjoy the experience. So I just kind of relaxed. I relaxed my eyes, and for a 10 or 15-minute period, I just sailed through this, and it was like being in a slow-motion hyperspace on Star Wars, where these lights are just going past you, and it was just the most beautiful experience. When I got to the Galapagos Islands, a couple of scientists from National Geographic asked me the same question you just asked me, and so I related them the same story. And they chuckled, and they said, "You know what those were?" And I said, "I never figured out what they were." Well, they're glow-in-the-dark squid. And they said the first time they saw them, they were flying through the sky. And I said, "What do you mean they were flying through the sky? Did they fly?" And he goes, "No. There was a very, very dark night, and there's one seagull that feeds at night, a nocturnal feeding seagull. And that seagull would dip down in the water, grab the squid, and then fly off with it. So we would see these glowing orbs flying off in the sky as the seagulls are feeding." Experiences like that are just so mesmerizing and so amazing, and it brings somewhat into perspective, if you can ever bring into perspective the amazing world that we live in, the amazing natural world we live in, and of course underneath the canopy of stars and stuff, this amazing universe we live in.
Do you have any plans to make another large trip like this, or sail anywhere else again in the future?
Oh yeah, I sail all the time. Since I've done this trip, I've been across the Atlantic again to Ireland and England and Scotland and over to Sweden and Norway. I always have a plan to sail somewhere else at some point or other in time. Right now, my focus is on the book and trying to promote the book out there and get that shared with people. I'm actually headed down to Florida and down to Cuba here in a week or so to bring a boat back from Cuba. But I'm not sure where the next adventure will take me or where it'll come from, but I expect one will pop up soon.
Is there anything else you would like to say about the book or your experiences to those listening right now?
I think the one thing that I think I can share with most people, having a dream in life is a really important thing. Persevering for it is a really important thing. Life changes all the time. It took me 40 years to get from a 12-year-old kid sailing on the beach of Lake Michigan to accomplishing my dream of sailing around the world. And there were certainly a lot of times I could have turned back in that 40 years or taken the advice of many other people who said, "Oh, you're never going to do that," or "You shouldn't do that." I'll admit there were some school counselors at the Dunland school system that told me I should be focusing on a more solid career in engineering or something like that. But what was really, what would be the right word, but important to me, I guess, was after I finished a trip around the world and was now sailing the boat back up to the marina there in Portsmouth, Rhode Island, as I came around the corner, headed into the marina, I realized that one moment validated everything I'd done in the last 40 years in this dream, whether it was, by some people thought it was wasted time or good time or energy, or the people that said I shouldn't do it, I should do engineering, or the people that thought I could do it and should do it. But it validated all that. So, if you're out there and you've got a dream and you're a high school student and you really want to be the next something or other, somebody telling you that's not going to happen, you can't do that, they're likely to be wrong. So it's up to you to pursue your dream, to persevere, to push on for it, and to stay in the game until you get the opportunity. And when you get the opportunity, be prepared to operate on it.
Well, Dave, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
That was Dave Rarick, a world sailor and CHS graduate who told us about his great adventures sailing around the world and his book, The Spirit of a Dream, A Sailor's Ultimate Journey Around the World, that he wrote about the trip. This concludes our Porter County Perspective program for today. Today's program has been pre-recorded. It will be rebroadcast tomorrow at noon. Thank you all for listening. I hope again you'll tune in next Thursday at 4 for another edition of Porter County Perspective. Until then, this is JD Corey signing off.
Porter County Perspective is brought to you in part through donation from Chesterton Tribune, your hometown newspaper serving the entire Dunland area since 1884.